Have you ever told a lie because you felt like you had absolutely no other choice? A lie born not out of malice, but out of pure, unadulterated desperation? Welcome back to the channel. Today, we are diving into a story from the American frontier that sounds like it was written for a Hollywood movie, but it is entirely wonderfully real. It's a story about two desperate people, two massive lies, and how sometimes the universe gives you exactly what you need instead of what you asked for. If you find yourself captivated by real human history that proves truth is stranger and more romantic than fiction, please do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let's travel back to the Montana Territory. The year is 1885. The American West is a place of wild promises and harsh realities, a landscape that could make a person just as easily as it could break them. In the Gallatin Valley of the Montana Territory, a 33-year-old man named Orin Stokes was doing his best not to let the land break him. Picture Orin. He was built like a fence post thin, rigidly straight, and deeply weather-beaten. For 6 grueling years, he had been fighting a daily war against the raw Montana prairie, trying to carve something that loosely resembled a farm out of the wilderness. If you squinted really hard and were feeling incredibly generous, you might call it a farm, but the reality was stark. He lived on 63 acres of barely broken sod. His comfortable homestead was nothing more than a 2-room cabin with a dirt floor, his established community, a single neighbor who spoke only Norwegian, and a dog. Orin was drowning in the sheer, crushing weight of surviving alone. He needed help. He needed a wife. But let's be completely clear. Orin Stokes was not looking for a great, sweeping romance. He was not looking for love. He was looking for survival. He needed someone who could cook a meal that wouldn't make him sick. Someone who knew how to preserve food so he wouldn't starve when the brutal Montana winter rolled in. Someone who could manage chickens, milk, atsauf, and finally keep his cabin from smelling like a man who had been isolated for 6 years. So he wrote a letter to a matrimonial agency, but he didn't write the truth. He wrote a fiction. His letter described a prosperous agricultural enterprise and established community ties. It painted a picture of a successful gentleman farmer. It was a lie of omission and a lie of exaggeration, thousands of miles away, in the bustling, civilized city of Philadelphia. A 26-year-old woman named Miriam Phelps. Read that letter. Miriam was a woman whose life had completely collapsed. Just a year prior, she was the 3rd daughter of a wealthy Philadelphia banker, living a life of privilege, surrounded by domestic servants and high society. But then came the panic of 1884, a severe economic depression that wiped her father out completely. The family lost everything. The grand house was sold off. The servants were dismissed, while her 2 older sisters had the good fortune of marrying well before the financial crash. Miriam found herself stranded. At 26, she was unmarried and completely untrained for any sort of profession. She was forced to move into her sister's spare bedroom. For Miriam, this wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a deep, humiliating shame. She felt like a charity case in her own family. The walls of that spare bedroom were closing in on her, reminding her every single day that she was a burden. Miriam needed an escape. The matrimonial agency wasn't her family's idea. It was hers. She didn't want a husband in the romantic sense. She just wanted to stop being a burden to her sister. When she read Orin's letter, she pictured a life similar to her father's country, house rustic, sûr, but civilized. She imagined a gentleman farmer with education, someone who owned land and perhaps a bookshelf. So Miriam wrote a letter back, and just like Orin, she lied. Her letter described her as a cultured young woman who was highly accomplished in domestic arts. She mentioned her vast experience in household management. Technically, and this wasn't entirely false, she had supervised domestic servants in her parents' home. But supervising is not doing. Her letter conveniently left out the fact that she had managed to burn water, had never so much as touched a cow in her life, and considered her absolute greatest domestic achievement to be arranging flowers in a vase. They were both terrible liars. They were both desperate, and they were absolutely perfect for each other, even though they were about to have the shock of their lives. Fast forward to September of 1885. The Northern Pacific train chugged into the depot at Bozeman, Montana. Orin was waiting. He had actually washed his one good shirt and shaved his face for the first time in 2 solid weeks. He was nervous, holding his breath as the passengers disembarked. And then Miriam stepped off the train. She was holding a hat box. She was holding a delicate parasol, and on her face was an expression of pure, undiluted, absolute horror. Orin's heart sank. His first thought upon seeing her was, she's pretty. His second thought was, she's holding a parasol in Montana. His third heavy realization was, I have made a terrible mistake. The wagon ride back to the homestead was agonizingly awkward as the wheels bumped over the rough, unpaved earth. Miriam looked around at the vast, empty wilderness, desperately seeking a sliver of the civilized life she was promised. She asked, "Where is the town?" Orin, looking straight ahead, replied simply, "We just left it." Miriam's voice dropped. That was a town. When they finally arrived at the 63 acres of dirt, the illusion completely shattered. Miriam stood in her expensive, city-tailored dress and stared. She looked at the tiny cabin. She looked at the dirt floor. She stared at the iron stove, which was literally held together with baling wire, and what looked like a desperate prayer. Where was the prosperous enterprise? Where was the gentleman farmer? Your letter said comfortable homestead. Miriam said, her voice tight, Orin, defensive and probably deeply embarrassed, replied, "It's comfortable compared to a tent." Miriam stared at him. "I have never lived in a tent. That is not a useful comparison." That very first evening was a disaster. Miriam, desperate to prove her worth and uphold her end of the domestic arts lie, attempted to cook supper. Remember, she had never actually cooked a day in her life. She was about to learn a very hard lesson. Supervising a kitchen and surviving in one are 2 entirely different universes. The meal she placed on the table was a culinary tragedy, The biscuits she baked were rock hard on the outside and completely raw dough in the middle. The coffee she brewed was so intensely strong it could have been used to strip paint off a barn, and the beans, somehow defying the laws of physics, were simultaneously burned to a crisp and completely undercooked. Orin stared at his plate. He hadn't even believed that was physically possible. But Orin Stokes did something remarkable that night. He didn't yell. He didn't complain. He sat at that table and he ate every single bite of that terrible meal. He didn't say a word. When he was finished, he quietly stood up and washed the dishes himself. Miriam sat alone at the wooden table, fighting with everything she had not to break down and cry. The humiliation was suffocating. What Orin didn't know yet, what he couldn't possibly understand, was that Miriam's disappointment in him and this place was matched only by her disappointment in herself. She had expected a civilized man with a bookshelf. She got a man who smelled faintly of horse, a cabin where the bitter wind whistled right through the wooden walls, and a home where the closest thing to literature was an outdated seed catalog from 1882. Miriam held it together until Orin finally went to sleep, then slipping out onto the porch. The banker's daughter from Philadelphia finally broke. She cried quietly into the cold Montana night. She looked up at the sky, and it was so incredibly full of stars, so vast and impossibly beautiful, that it felt like the universe was playing a cruel joke on her. How could there be so much breathtaking beauty hanging right over so much agonizing hardship? But as the sun began to rise on her first morning in Montana, something inside Miriam shifted. She made a choice. It was the choice that would define the rest of her life. She decided that she did not have to love this place. She did not even have to accept it, but she was going to learn it. Because for 26 years, Miriam Phelps had been a decorative, useless object. And as she watched the sun come up over the Gallatin Valley, she decided she was completely done being useless. At 5:00 a.m., Orin woke up to find this woman standing in his dirt floor kitchen, wearing a dress that probably cost more than his prized cow waiting for him. She looked him in the eye and asked him to teach her everything. She asked him to teach her how to cook on a temperamental wood stove. She asked him to show her how to milk a terrifyingly large cow. She asked him to teach her how to knead bread so the middle wasn't raw, and how to survive in a place that looked absolutely nothing like the letter he had sent her. Orin was stunned. He had ordered a woman who already knew how to do these things. Instead, he got a woman who couldn't do a single one of them, but possessed the fierce, terrifying grit to demand to learn at 5 a.m. "You really can't cook." Orin said, the reality finally settling in. "I really cannot." Miriam admitted, lifting her chin. "But I can learn anything if someone shows me once." Orin raised an eyebrow. "Once? I have a very good memory." Miriam replied, "I just have no experience." Orin Stokes looked at this small, out-of-place woman, and for the first time since he was a young boy, he felt a flicker of an emotion he hadn't expected to feel for a mail-order bride. Profound respect. The next 3 months were a crucible. They were brutally tested, not just because the physical labor on the frontier was backbreaking, which it was, but because the hardest work the American West ever demanded was learning to live with and understand a stranger. You did not choose, but Miriam learned she was relentless. The biscuit slowly evolved from completely inedible to somewhat acceptable to genuinely good over the span of 3 weeks. Her coffee transitioned from a lethal paint stripper to a strong, bracing morning cup. She learned the grueling tasks of preserving tomatoes, salting heavy slabs of pork, and drying apples for the winter. More than that, she learned the silent, vital language of the frontier things. Nobody could have ever taught her back in polite Philadelphia society. She learned how to read the incoming weather just by observing the specific color of the sky hovering over the Gallatin Range. She learned how to tell if a massive cow was sick simply by the way the animal stood in the pasture. She learned the frustrating, freezing art of starting a fire in a cast iron stove using damp wood on mornings when the temperature inside their little cabin had dropped below freezing. And Miriam watched her own body change. Her delicate hands, which had spent 26 years doing nothing harder than turning the soft pages of a book, began to blister. They cracked and bled in the cold, but then they healed. They became something entirely new. Strong, capable hands that gripped, lifted, kneaded, and held their own weight. By November, Miriam wasn't just surviving. She was running the household. By December, she was running it better, more efficiently, and more comfortably than Orin ever had in his 6 solitary years. She completely reorganized his chaotic pantry. She ingeniously insulated the freezing cabin walls using old newspapers and a homemade flour paste to block the wind. She sat by the fire and mended every single piece of ragged clothing Orin owned, most of which hadn't seen a needle and thread since they were bought at the general store years ago. Miriam was transforming, but Orin was transforming to, Orin was slowly learning that he had been completely wrong about what a man out in the wild actually needed to survive. He thought he just needed a cook, but what he got was a woman who, when the brutal work of the day was done, opened a hat box and pulled out a single book. It was a book of poetry. She had smuggled it all the way from Philadelphia because it was the only possession she simply could not bear to leave behind. In the evenings, Miriam began to read aloud. Orin had never heard poetry read aloud in his entire life. He had never heard the English language used purely for beauty, rather than for utility and function. The very first time Miriam read the words of John Keats to him, illuminated only by the soft glow of a lamplight, while a violent Montana blizzard shook the walls of the cabin. Orin sat frozen in his chair. He felt something fundamental shift deep inside the architecture of his own understanding. He realized in that quiet lamplight moment that there were things in this harsh world that actually mattered besides crop yields, cattle, and mere survival. There were words that existed not to tell you how to plant a seed, but simply to make a human being feel a little less alone in the dark. Orin wanted to give her something back. So he built her a bookshelf. Orin was a terrible carpenter. The shelf he made was visibly crooked, and the joints where the wood met were painfully obvious and clumsy. But when he gave it to Miriam, she looked at it as if it were made of solid gold. It was, without a doubt, the most beautiful thing she had ever received. Why? because it was the very first gift anyone in her entire life had ever given her that acknowledged the things she actually valued in her soul. She placed her single poetry book on that crooked shelf. Then, filled with a new kind of hope, she wrote a letter back to Philadelphia, begging her sister to box up and send every single book the family hadn't already sold off. By January, a package containing 14 books arrived. Miriam carefully, proudly shelved them by subject on Orin's crooked creation. Orin, a man who previously only read the 1,882 seed catalog, ended up reading 3 of those books by March. He started with the familiar agricultural catalog, but under Miriam's influence, he eventually found his way to William Shakespeare. They were not passionately in love yet, but they were doing something more important. They were teaching each other, and out on the lonely frontier, that is almost always how true love starts. It doesn't begin with a sudden magical spark. It begins with an exchange of effort, a respect, and time. But the moment it finally clicked, the moment their arrangement officially transformed into profound, unbreakable love, happened on the absolute coldest night of the entire year. And fittingly for Orin and Miriam, it involved a cow. It was January 19, 1886. The temperature in the Gallatin Valley plummeted to a bone-chilling 37 degrees below zero. Let me put that in perspective for you. That is the kind of severe, unforgiving cold that can kill a massive cow while it's still standing up. It's the kind of freezing air that instantly turns your warm breath into ice crystals before it even fully leaves your mouth. At midnight, in 37 degrees below zero, Orin's beast, most valuable milk cow, went into hard labor out in the barn. Orin suited up to go out into the deadly cold. He did not ask Miriam to come with him. He fully expected her to stay inside the warm, insulated cabin. After all, she was still a banker's daughter from Philadelphia, and this brutal, freezing barn was not her world. But Miriam didn't stay inside. She put on every single layer of clothing she owned. She tightly wrapped her hands in thick wool, and she marched out into the freezing black night, carrying a glass lantern. She walked into that barn, fueled by an absolute, unbreakable refusal to be the kind of woman who stayed warm and safe inside while the real work and her partner was struggling outside. The situation in the barn was dire. The calf was breached. Orin desperately needed both of his hands to reach in and physically turn the calf. But he also desperately needed a third hand to hold the lantern so he could see what he was doing. He hadn't had a third hand to help him in 6 years. And he had lost good calves because of it. This time, he had Miriam. Miriam held the lantern. She stood in that sub-zero barn and held it perfectly steady, without shaking, for 45 agonizing minutes while Orin worked frantically to save the animals. The cold was unimaginable. Miriam's hands slowly went completely numb. She lost all feeling in her fingers. She couldn't even feel the metal handle of the lantern anymore. But she held it anyway. She knew with absolute certainty that if she dropped that light, Orin would be plunged into total darkness. The mother cow would die, the calf would die, and everything they had worked for would suffer. She was not going to let that happen. Finally, at 0 inches the morning, the calf came out It was alive. It was wet, shivering, and breathing. Orin caught the heavy calf in his arms and gently set it down in the hay beside its exhausted mother. Panting, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He looked up at Miriam. Her face was paper white from the dangerous cold. Her hands were still tightly locked around the lantern handle, locked in a death grip that she physically could not release because the muscles in her hands had literally frozen into position. Orin gently stepped toward her. He took the lantern from her frozen grip. Then he took her hands in his. He brought them to his mouth and began to breathe on them long, slow, deep breaths of warm air, patiently thawing her fingers one by one until she could finally move them again. They stood close in the freezing dirt. Miriam looked at him, her voice trembling but clear. Your letter said prosperous agricultural enterprise, she whispered. Orin looked back at her. Your letter said accomplished in domestic arts, he replied softly. We are both terrible liars. She said, we are. Orin agreed. There was a pause. The wind howled outside the barn. I would not change my letter. Miriam said, Orin didn't hesitate. I would not change mine. And right there, standing in a freezing barn at 0 inches the morning, surrounded by the smell of hay and a newborn calf, they faced their two massive lies. They shared an honest, shivering, completely unplanned recognition. What they ended up with was absolutely nothing like what either of them had ordered. It was infinitely better. In March of 1886, they made it official. They were married properly by a preacher in Bozeman. It was a very small, quiet ceremony. Miriam proudly wore a dress that she had sewn with her own capable hands. And Orin wore his one good washed shirt. The story doesn't just end with a wedding, though real love stories are built over decades, over the next 30 years. Orin and Miriam Stokes took those 63 acres of dirt and turned them into 300 acres of thriving land. They successfully raised cattle, grew fields of wheat, and raised 4 strong children. They brought the best of both their worlds to their family. Miriam patiently taught every single one of their children how to read before they reached the age of 5. Orin, in turn, taught every single one of them how to do a hard day's work before they turned 7. That crooked little bookshelf Orin built eventually grew to fill an entire wall. The dirt floor cabin was expanded into a proper, beautiful house with a real wooden floor, a floor that Miriam absolutely insisted upon, and that Orin proudly built himself. He built it poorly at first, but just like everything else, he learned to do it better. Miriam, the city girl, who once burnt boiling water, eventually became widely known as the absolute best cook in the entire Gallatin Valley. It was a fact acknowledged by everyone in the territory, except, of course, by Miriam herself, who would humbly wave it off and say, I am adequate. The bar in Montana is simply lower than in Philadelphia. And Orin read every single book that ever touched that massive shelf. He became a man of literature as much as a man of the earth. Years later, he was heard bragging to a neighbor, perfectly summing up the great gamble of his life. I ordered a cook and got a library. Best trade I ever made? Orin Stokes passed away in 1918 at the age of 66, having lived a full, rich life. He couldn't have imagined as a lonely homesteader. Miriam lived on until 1932, passing away at the age of 73. And right up until the very end of her days, she kept her routine every evening. In The Banker's Daughter from Philadelphia, would sit in her Montana home and read poetry aloud to herself. So, what is the lesson we can take from the incredible lives of Orin and Miriam? It's this. Sometimes our grandest plans and our most specific expectations are the very things holding us back from the life we are meant to live. Orin wanted a maid. Miriam wanted a wealthy escape. What they got was a struggle, a freezing cabin, and a partner who forced them to grow into the best versions of themselves. True partnership isn't about finding someone who perfectly checks all the boxes on a list you created. It's about finding someone who will stand next to you in the freezing cold, hold the lantern steady, and refuse to leave you in the dark. The most beautiful lives aren't ordered out of a catalog. They are built day by day, mistake by mistake, in the dirt and the snow. Thank you so much for joining me today for this incredible journey into the past. If this story moved you, or if you just love discovering the hidden human elements of history, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel out. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another story. Until next time, remember to look past the dirt floors in your own life and keep an eye out for the poetry. See you in the next video.